Let's speak now to Thembisa Fakude, who's a Senior Research Fellow and Director at Africa-Asia Dialogues. He joins us via Zoom. Thembisa, this is quite a thing to see. These are sites that we normally observe in Hong Kong, not mainland China. Give us a sense of just how unprecedented what we're seeing is.
Well, this is very unprecedented for protesters to be calling for the resignation of Xi Jinping and the resignation of the Communist Party is quite serious, and it's spreading. Last time we had these protests were concentrated in Xinjiang and in Wuhan, but now we know that they've moved on to Shanghai. So it's spreading, and these young people, by and large, are intensifying this call. But it was a matter of time that these frustrations were going to blow over. The zero COVID infection policy of China was just simply not sustainable. Remember all those scenes, for example, whenever there's a suspicion that one person inside the mall was infected by COVID, then the mall will be shut down and everybody else who was inside will then be forced to quarantine. And over the past couple of months, we've seen scenes of people forcing their way out of the malls because of those kind of suspicions. So it was just a matter of time that you're gonna have these frustrations spilling out and expressing themselves in a manner which they're being expressed at the moment.
And I suppose it's a difficult sell for China to try and go the zero COVID rate when the rest of the world isn't there, and yet they're not suffering the consequences of this pandemic as it was in its height. So that inside China, to try and convince its people that zero tolerance for COVID is the only way must be a hard sell.
Yeah, well, I think what's happening in Xinjiang is, Xinjiang is one of those places where the Chinese authorities are accused of oppressing the Muslims in Xinjiang. And that, coupled with what has happened now, has actually led to the current situation. But at the same time, it benefits China, this continual closing of some of the cities, because one, it forces most Chinese to stay within China and spend within China. But at the same time, it's an emergency law, which means that the government has got powers to do as it wishes. So it's a perpetuation of autocracy, and many people now are feeling that China is abusing the zero COVID infection policy to pursue its own political objective.
It was as recent as last month that Xi Jinping cemented his position as the supreme leader, giving himself getting a third term as the leader of the country. And some saying that he has become more powerful, the most powerful leader since Chairman Mao himself. Should he be worried by what he's seeing?
I think he should be worried by what he's seeing. But as I've said, the zero COVID infection policy has been used to push certain agendas that we don't know about, because the entire world is open up, and one will expect that China will open up as well. But this is the biggest challenge for him, because he has, as you said, in the past month has assumed unprecedented powers in recent times in China, and that made him one of the most powerful leaders in China. But we see now something that we've seen in Hong Kong in the past, now coming into major cities in China, and this is certainly going to put him on a back foot as he assumes this new powers that has been given by the Communist Party of China.
You mentioned the Chinese Muslims, but I wonder, often one thing is a trigger, but the underlying angst can be over a number of other issues that have been lying dormant for some time. Is this what we're seeing in China?
I think that's what we're seeing. And this is mainly because of these COVID-19 restrictions. As I've said earlier, it was just a matter of time. You couldn't continually keep people basically in prison for 3 years. Chinese have not been able to move. Chinese have not been able to travel outside China. Chinese have not been able to have a normal life. And at the same time, we see one man and his political party gaining more and more powers. And in the meantime, while everybody else is kind of restricted in their own homes, they are actually gaining more powers to do as they please in China. So it was a matter of time that you'll see this happening. But also at the same time, you've got a lot of things happening around the world, and students spending more time on the internet, they're getting other ideas. And one will argue that now that they're not spending more time outside, they're spending more time online, there are a lot of other communications that are coming through to China that ordinarily would not come in.
All right, perhaps let me ask another way. These young people, they see the state of freedoms that other people are enjoying around the world, freedom of speech, freedom of activity. I mean, there are websites that are banned in China as we speak, and they are very strictly controlled. And I just wonder if some of this, and especially when they see what's happening in neighboring Hong Kong, some of the freedoms their counterparts there enjoy, is there something brewing? I mean, 1989, Tiananmen Square, that didn't just come out of the blue.
Oh yeah, I think there's something brewing. I mean, notwithstanding, of course, that China economy is doing very well and there's increased level of comforts, but I'll argue that the time, 3 years, that is, of young people spending most of their time on the internet and interacting somehow and bypassing some of the restrictions with the entire world, it has inspired them to start wishing for other freedoms that are currently not in China. Particularly what has happened in Hong Kong has triggered some kind of anxiety within China. And Chinese are now seeing, and as a result of COVID-19 again, because most of them are now sitting in front of computers and interacting with the world via that medium, they're now getting inspired in terms of them wanting similar freedoms in their own country. And this is actually backfiring for China. And I think we are likely to see more and more of these protests. Yes, they were triggered by these COVID-19 restrictions, but there are bigger issues in China that require attention, particularly of those that are currently protesting at the moment.
So how will Beijing deal with this? In the past, there would be no doubt the army, the security forces would be unleashed and this would have been put down. The world is watching. There's a new order. It won't be as simple this time around, I'm guessing.
Well, the immediate response was to try and relax some of the restrictions, which was positive. And I think what Xi Jinping is going to try and do in terms of quelling these protests is going to try and relax some of those restrictions. That's a good thing to do and the best thing to do. I don't think it'll follow the path that has been embraced by Iran, for example, after the death of Mahsa Amini, where the government dug in his heels and started shooting and killing young people into submission and sentencing some of them into life and death sentences. So I think Xi Jinping is going to try and appease these young people. But the call is out. They're already calling for him to resign, and they're calling for the Communist Party of China to also resign. So I'm not quite sure whether it will be easy for them to withdraw those calls.
All right, we'll talk about what could possibly happen going forward. But Xi Jinping himself, I guess, is caught between a rock and a hard place, because if he gives too much concession, essentially what you've done is taught people how to get what they want. Demonstrations yield results. And this is something that might become difficult for him to put back the genie in the bottle if he gives too much away.
It's true, but I think knowing how the authorities in China has responded in such instances in the past, case in point Hong Kong, I doubt if they will embrace anything similar when they are called to deal with these protests. They are likely to be as harsh as they were in Hong Kong in dealing with these protests. So we'll have to wait and see how this is going to pan out. I mean, Hong Kong, of course, was a different case, because Hong Kong, although part of China, but it's always been independent, and the culture has been different. Now you're dealing with people from within China proper, and the manner in which the police will deal with this could just trigger something much more bigger than what you've seen happening in Hong Kong.
All right, so it's one thing to ask for a head of state to step down. The Chinese Communist Party could easily find a replacement. They're probably set up in that way anyway. But when people start saying the Chinese Communist Party must disappear, what kind of China might unravel? Because this is uncharted waters.
Well, that's a little bit tall order, but I think it's also trying to push the boundaries by calling for the impossible. And I think this is going to widen the protests. And I don't see that happening, of course, anytime soon. The Communist Party of China is well cemented in Chinese politics. They have much more, bigger control of the country. Xi Jinping has been given much more bigger powers, unprecedented. So it's going to take some time. But this is of great concern, of course, as China continues to move forward with its economic successes. This might just disturb that. And when China opens up eventually, as I've said, I think during this time, the COVID-19 restriction period, they've been planning for post-COVID China. And I think this might just disturb those plans as these young people continue now or begin to call for more powers and more freedoms in China.
All right. Talking about external viewpoints, I mean, the Americas of this world certainly won't be commenting on an internal situation of this nature, even though they may have been tempted in other parts of the world to talk about freedoms and things like that. This they'll leave alone, I'm sure.
I don't think they'll leave it alone. I mean, they've always been speaking. They spoke against Hong Kong. I think the Americans and the British in particular will speak against this. But the other thing is they're also going to be the first low-hanging victims in terms of China accusing them of fueling this and supporting these protests as it had happened in Iran. So if the Americans are to be entering this, they are going to be facing serious criticism from China.
All right. So what do you see happening in the next week or so?
Next week or so, I foresee the shutting down of internet. I foresee the cracking down of those protests. But at the same time, there will be some kind of olive branch approach from Xi Jinping and his government towards the Chinese population. So there will be these parallel approaches. One will be a harsh approach in terms of trying to suppress those protests and suppressing the internet, but at the same time, I think Xi Jinping is going to try and give in on some of the restrictions.
All right. I love using this word, but could this be a minor inflection point where the relationship between state and citizens shifts slightly?
This is historical. It has never happened before. It's the first time it's happening under Xi Jinping. So this is historical. What happened today, particularly those calls which were amplified, although of course they came from few people, but we now associate them with those protesters in Beijing. So today was a very historical moment in the history of China. So we are likely to see other things happening again. But as I've said, the internet is likely to be suppressed henceforth. So we are unlikely to see more of these videos escaping the authorities in China into the wider world.
All right, and that's where we'll leave it. Thembisa, thank you so much. Always good talking to you. I'm going to test your Mandarin. 谢谢.
I told you, I don't know anything. Ask me, do not want to.
Sharp. Okay, Thembisa Fakude, one of our regular commentators there, Senior Research Fellow and Director at Africa-Asia Dialogues. Historic moments that we're witnessing in China at the moment as the people are pushing back on these restrictions that the Chinese authorities are enforcing regarding COVID-19.